What is up, plant community? Green Thumb here. So, this video that I'm about to make may get me hated within the community, but I feel like it's a subject that needs to be talked about. And that is, are plants truly as eco-friendly and environmentally friendly as people claim they are? Well, we're going to do a deep dive into that. A real deep dive. So let's talk about it. So are plants environmentally friendly? Well, let's start getting to the cultivation of everything. Oh, look, that's starting to flower. I just noticed that's flowering. Ah! Sorry, ADHD. Anyways, so the thing we gotta take into consideration is how plants are produced. So most of your plants are produced by basically propagating or tissue culture, which tissue culture doesn't have much of an environmental impact, and propagation has a little bit of an environmental impact. Because when you propagate a plant, you need lots of water depending on how you propagate it. So when you propagate a plant, you're going to need lots of water to basically sustain it, so that way it can grow them roots. So that way it generates the plant, be like, oh, look, I got to grow in order to survive, I got to grow in this moist soil. Or you're still going to need lots of water in order to grow roots. Say if you take a cutting and put it in the water. So that's something to take into consideration whenever you are buying a plant. Another thing that we got to keep in mind too is in cultivation, and we get these plants shipped out in the big box stores, we always get plastic pots. Now, as a guy who works, which I know this is going to be contradictory, but trust me, I'm doing it for the money, or else I would not be working in such a factory. I work in a plastic factory, and I can tell you, because we make a lot of Milwaukee products and things like that, it should be no different for plastic pots, that you have a lot of water and a lot of oil being made just to produce one pot. That's one pot produced to be trimmed on the edges. If it has a flash, then you have microplastics going out into the environment if they don't recycle their plastic, and then those microplastics go out into the environment, thus damaging the environment if they don't recycle them. And basically what you're left with is something like this, or something like that, or even that guy over there, or that pot over there. And those are the end result of the products with plastic pots. In order to make one plastic pot, you're using a lot of fossil fuels, and you use a lot of water. So that there is a lot on the environmental impacts there. Alright, so a pot. If you have a plastic pot, I would recommend to simply just reuse your plastic pots or recycle the plastic pots. Don't just throw them out and never reuse them again. Maybe you can reuse them to propagate and maybe sell plants. But yeah, so you're using a lot of fossil fuels right there. And take it from a guy who's actually working at a plastic factory. Like you're already doing a lot there just by simply buying the pot. Alright, now let's get into the soil. Let's talk about that soil. So, a lot of your soil, depending on which soil you get, if you get cheap soil, you have bark in there, like this. Alright, that's fine and dandy. But the issue is with bark has a lot of CO2 in it. So in order to grow a tree, say example, the junipers, or even this dwarf tree, that whole trunk there is nothing but CO2. So when you take something like mulch, or you take something like this stuff here, and you let it naturally decay, well, all that CO2 goes back up into the environment. So carbon monoxide that the tree originally had was already going back out into the environment. Now, that doesn't have as much emissions as, say, having a plastic pot. It doesn't release as much carbon. But the other thing, too, about plastic pots I forgot to mention is the shipment. You're going to have a lot of carbon just getting those shipped everywhere because plastic pots are sold all around the world. So that's a lot of CO2 going in the air, just not to make the pot, but to mass produce them for the whole world. Alright, but anyways, away from the plastic pots, but yeah, so you know. And that's why I say soil, your garden soil isn't garden soil. All it is compost. And if you want to watch that video where I go into detail about the differences between garden soil, potting soil, and basically native soil, I have a video of that you are free to watch. Anyway, so yeah, that there has some environmental damages, especially when you use something called peat moss. Because peat moss takes 1,000 years to decay, and it's basically nothing but decaying plant matter that is then harvested. Well, now you're probably like, well, alright, that's fine, Mr. Green Thumb. I'll use soils like this that are more airy and more natural, has some bark in them, and, well, maybe not bark, but, you know, a lot of perlite. Well, I hate to break it to you, but perlite is also environmentally damaged. Damaging, as perlite is simply harvested. Perlite is nothing but puffed stone, soft stone that is harvested and thus doing environmental damages. It's usually harvested out of places like China, where there are these big quarries. If you don't believe me, you can Google it. You can Google perlite mining. So, therefore, even when you use soil like this, guess what? It's still environmentally damaging because you're still buying and consuming perlite. So, take that with what you will, because it's still being mined, and you're still using it. Because you need it for the benefit of the plants. Well, then you can probably say, well, fine, I'll just throw in something like that, stones. Go ahead, that's still environmentally damaging either way you look at it, because you're talking about, well, gravel now, and gravel is also harvested and mined, so there's really no way around soil that is going to be okay for you to use that isn't going to have an environmental impact some way, somehow. Alright, so now let's talk about things like tropical gardening. Well, alright, tropical gardening, what are the environmental impacts of that? There couldn't really be much environmental impacts. Wrong. You're taking an alien plant. Alright, you're taking something that is completely alien and throwing it out into the environment. That's not native, has never been seen by animals. Animals don't know how to react to it, don't know what to do around it, don't even know if it will bear fruit that's edible, thus potentially making a plant invasive. For example, even though it's not, and I haven't seen it get invasive here, Musa Baju or Japanese banana. And in some cases, well, we have a little palm over there where it could get potentially invasive. But the environmental impacts of it is the same. It's going to come in a peat-based soil, and you're going to have a big old plastic pot around it, and you're taking that plastic off, and you're probably going to throw it away and never probably use it again, and putting it in the ground. Then you got to get another pot to basically store it if you have something like the Red City banana, which alone has environmental impacts. Well, it doesn't really have environmental impacts. It has environmental impacts of being shipped, unless you let it die. which if you let it die and you don't dig it up, then that's carbon that's going back into the air, which then you have to go out and consume another plant, which thus has more environmental impacts. So there's almost no way around the environmental impacts. Even if you're buying something cold hardy like a juniper, nice, good choice, alien plant though, environmental impact. Even your grass really is environmentally impacting. So that's where the environmental impacts really come in, is when we talk about that. And now we could talk about human health too when it comes to something like, for example, house plants. Like, for example, your ferns here. Say if you wanted to have a fern for a house plant. Well, what's the health risk of that? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Well, from a guy who has allergies, there could be a lot of things wrong with that. For example, ferns release spores in the wind. So if you have a fan that simply is blowing, well, those spores basically is going to blow around the wind of that fan. And if it's going around in the room, the wind is circulating, then bam, and you go breathe all that. Might as well admit to what it is, plant sperm in your nose, and you're going to have allergies. Even with plants like the coleus over there that flowers, you know. So most of your plants will have a health effect on you one way or another. Now, this is also the same for my favorite tree, which I've been growing, which is the, well, Ficus benjamina, or weeping fig, you know. There's been times I've pruned it, and there's been times where branches have just broken off. Or I pruned and I maybe gotten a little too low when that branch was probably good. And thus the sap gets out, and guess what? That sap evaporates into the air, thus can cause you to have allergies. And, you know, it's the same for elephant ears. Elephant ears, if you overwater them, they drip a liquid, which then evaporates, and that liquid is toxic. So that's something to keep in mind. Oh, and, yeah, these guys. Yeah, they're definitely toxic. So, yeah, take that with what you will if you want to grow that as a house plant. I mean, they'll straight up kill squirrels. They're called castor beans, and they release these seeds, which look like beans. If a squirrel gets a hold of it, oh, it's game over. A cat, dog, decides that they want to even munch on this plant, it's game over. Environmental impact. Even things like your natives, where you're trying to curb the environmental impact. Like, for example, this here is a cultivar of our native swamp hibiscus. Beautiful hibiscus, beautiful guy. Love him. Love that it's blooming. Alright, sorry about that, guys. That was rude. Anyways, yeah, so they can even have an environmental impact just because you're taking a plastic pot. Now, with that being said, what are things we can do to really curb environmental impacts? Well, the truth is if you're going to consume plants and keep consuming plants, there's really nothing you can do, and I know I'm bad about it because there's just so many plants I want. But what are things we can do to possibly stop this? Well, if you have a plant in a garden that you really like, that's a tropical plant, like maybe this polka dot plant over here, or this Monstera deliciosa, you can simply just dig it up and store it for the winter time, and that way it has less of an environmental impact. And that way you have that plant, you can prop it and do all that stuff, and you don't have to worry about simply going out and having to replace that plant for next year. Because we also got to remember too, every time we take a plant and it dies, and we go out and buy another plant, well, that's more soil being used, the shipper shipping more plants, and plus more plastic pots being used. So that's things we gotta keep in mind. Every time we fell on a plant, they're expecting you to fail your first time, and well, that's where you have to buy more plants. But we could kind of curve that by helping each other out, giving advice and things like that. Now, I'm not always going to be the best at advice for your plants because, well, for example, how I grow here, it's going to be different maybe to how you have to grow plants in Arizona or something like that. More of a drier environment. Another thing that we can do too is instead of getting plants that simply trying to knock off that dust that simply require a lot of water, we can get more desert-like plants or more plants that don't really require a lot of water, like I'm not going to mention any names, but you know who you are. Pygmy date palm. I mentioned its name. Anyways, so yeah, we can get plants that really don't require a lot of water or can go through drought. And that would definitely help curb the water situation. Or you can get like a little bottle like I got, a little water bottle, poke a hole in it, and get distilled water, and you could focus your watering instead of having it just spread out everywhere like a maniac that's just watering everything. So that's another option you can do to kind of help. But that's certain things I do. Another thing you can do to help with a plastic pot situation is just reuse your pots. Just absolutely reuse them. Get glass pots, because all glass is sand. When it breaks down, guess what it's going to turn back into? Sand. Get terracotta. All terracotta is clay. But then we got to argue with the environmental impacts of those too, which is a simple fact that they use fire, coal, things like that just to basically make those pots. The only thing we can really do to stop the curve with environmental impacts on pots is basically just reuse our pots. Even if they're a little chipped or damaged, just keep on reusing them until they fully break down. They're no longer usable. For example, this is my Chinese fan palm. It's broke here, but guess what? I'm still going to use that pot until it completely breaks down and it is no longer usable. This pot here, you can't see it right now, but there's a chip in the pot. Guess what? I'm still going to use it until it's completely unusable anymore. Even if the colors have faded. For example, this red pot right here, its color's kind of faded. Guess what? I'm still going to use it until I can't no more. This pot here, this tree has been in this pot for a few years now, and it's still going strong. So that's one thing we can do too, is if we buy pots with bigger plants in them or anything like that, well, we could save those pots and reuse them. That will definitely cut back a lot. But yeah, otherwise than that, there's not really much you can do to curb that environmental impact, because no matter what you do, there's going to be an environmental consequence or impact on what you do. We're going to have a carbon footprint. But this is not to discourage you from getting plants or anything like that. By all means, get plants, get tropical plants. Love your tropical plants. Love your garden plants. All plants deserve love. Make your yard beautiful, make your garden beautiful, continue to zone push, do what you gotta do. Grow interesting things. But just always be aware that somewhere along the line, you're gonna have a carbon footprint, no matter what you do. So that's something we do have to keep in mind. No matter what we do, there's gonna be a carbon footprint, even if we have annuals and we let them die. Well, guess what? That's carbon that plant had stored that's going back up in the air. One thing you could do for your annuals, like I said, just dig them up, store them over the winter. That way you don't have to buy them again, and you're saving money that way too. But yeah, that's about all you can do. And then the plants dying and trying to learn from that, well, that's got to be your biggest carbon footprint there, and there ain't no way around that. Because let me tell you, I've killed so many plants trying to learn how to care for plants. That's just part of it. So, yeah, ain't really much you guys can do. Ain't too much folks can do. So, yeah, otherwise than that, not to be a Debbie Downer, not to tell you that plants are bad, because plants ain't bad. They give a lot more impacts rather than defects on your life. So get them and grow them, love them, cherish them, etc. Otherwise than that, folks, not trying to be a Debbie Downer, but as always, keep it real and keep it tropical.